Hi, good morning, and welcome to our fourth episode of Ohio Rock Talks. Just to give you a recap of what we've done so far, we had our first episode on basic facts about rocks, about fossils, excuse me. And if you missed it, that's okay. Andy and Tyler today they'll cover a little bit of everything and make sure that you understand what's going on. The following week, we talked about ancient marine fossils and how Ohio was covered with an ocean, essentially. And then last week, we talked about ancient land fossils. And I was shocked to find out that we had giant dragonflies and millipedes. But if that's not terrifying enough this week, I think Tyler or Andy are going to tell us about giant beavers and sloths. So get ready for that. And then next week's our last one with how to find fossils around Ohio. Where can you go and fossil hunt on your own? So I'm excited to get started today. I'm Alyssa Gapel. Thanks for joining us. I have with me today Chuck Salmons, who's going to help me with the Q&A. So I just want to point out the Q&A box. Please feel free to use it to ask us questions, make any comments that you want. Just say hello, whatever you like. We're here to listen and try and answer your questions. And then I have with me, I have Tyler Norris, who is going to start off today, and Andy Nash, who will be following up with his presentation. So I'm going to hand it over to Tyler now, and we'll get started.
Okay. Great, so thank you, Alyssa. Does everybody see my screen okay? I hope. So, as I mentioned, my name is, or as Alyssa mentioned, my name is Tyler Norris. And you may remember me from last week's webinar where we talked about Ohio's land, plants, and animals. And we'll continue talking about land, plants, and animals today, except for we'll be talking about a more recent period of geological time. And a little bit more about me. I'm a glacial geologist that investigates the surface materials of Ohio, and many of these ground materials come from the last ice age. And we can learn so much about Ohio's past landscape by studying these ground materials because they tell us about how the glaciers moved and crossed Ohio. And in fact, hopefully you can see this map behind me. It shows all the different glacial deposits in Ohio. So it can get quite complicated, so it's one of my jobs to kind of help investigate these materials. So what they're made up of and how thick they are, and explain kind of how it shaped Ohio's landscape today. But one of the important things that we know about these ice age deposits is that we sometimes find animals and plants that are found in them from time to time that are stuck in these deposits the glaciers left behind. So I'm going to talk more about the mammals and things that we saw from the ice age, and Andy will give you some more information about some of the smaller plants and animals and how it's used in glacial research. So I'm going to start up by opening my presentation here. Okay. So everybody can see my presentation now, I hope. So before we get into the fossils of this time, let's just first kind of discuss how they got there in the first place, such as our elephant friend here pictured. So as a brief review, this is the geological time scale. So an important way to describe these rocks at different time periods is by using this time scale. You may have learned from the past rock talks that each time zone is broken down into very large sections of time, like eons, like the Archean eon we have at the bottom, which can cover billions of years, or eras such as the Cenozoic, or even periods such as the Pennsylvanian or the Permian. And if you recall from last week's rock talks, these rocks from Ohio can be found within these different periods of time. And the last rocks that are found in Ohio are from the Permian time period. Hold on a minute. It seems like, are we having problems with the presentation? You guys see it, what I'm seeing? No?
I can't see it, Tyler.
Okay, hold on a moment then. How about now?
Yes.
Great.
Just 1 second, it'll go live. There we go.
Okay. So let's take it back for a moment here. And I was talking about this time scale that you guys saw with the eons and the eras and the periods. And you may recall that the Permian period was the last time that we had rocks that were deposited in Ohio. And ever since then, we have no more rocks. However, we do have deposits or sediment from the more recent time periods. And this is from the Ice Age, where we have this upper piece of the time scale. And we know more about this section of time known as epoch or an epoch, and it can be expanded into greater detail since we know more about Earth's recent history. And specifically within the Cenozoic time period, we have these mammals and other forms of life that are more similar than what we're used to today. So as opposed to the armored fish and the large-scale trees and the dinosaurs from older time periods. So specifically, we have these mammals take off during this time. And as I said, we have information from the Pleistocene, which is 2.6 million to 11,700 years ago, but mostly in the later parts when Ohio was occasionally shaped and covered by ice. And into today, which is the Holocene, or recent history. So this is where we have time exposed in Ohio from where we have ice that was deposited. And here's some maps from North America during these times. So where did all this ice come from? We had ice and snow that began piling up as a sheet of ice around Canada, North America, and the North Pole. And this spread all the way down south to Ohio as these glaciers moved and accumulated ice and snow. And it would advance to the south and it would retreat to the north when it was warmer during warmer periods. And this happened several times throughout the Pleistocene. And these ice sheets would carry everything other than ice. It would carry dirt and rocks and other pieces of the landscape when it moved. And when we're talking about the Ice Age fossils and animals, some animals evolved here in North America. And as you can see, this is North America, what it looks like today. Ohio is denoted by the star. But some of these animals traveled across some other continents. So if you recall, when water evaporates from the ocean and then it precipitates or falls on land, the land would freeze into this big ice sheet. And the water levels or the sea levels from the ocean would drop because all that water is stored on land rather than being on the ocean or in the ocean. And this actually exposed the big land bridge that connected North America to Siberia. And this is known as the Bering Strait. And this is where different animals and people would travel. And they could migrate across Alaska and all the way down to Ohio. And what caused these glaciations overall is a little complicated, but it involves these variations in Earth and Sun orbits. And which also relates to changes in solar radiation, the atmosphere, climate, and even the ocean currents. And all of these changes influence the landscape we see today and how life had to adjust at this time. And here's a simplified glacial map of Ohio, which tells us that the glaciers covered 2/3 of the whole state. And there's that more detailed one behind me that you may have seen and I've mentioned. You also notice there's an unglaciated southeastern portion where the ice didn't quite make it. But currently, you understand there's 3 major glaciations named after Midwest states that we have a lot of evidence of this ice. And some of that ice occurred in Ohio during the latter part of the Pleistocene. And all these glaciations left behind glacial deposits that cover the land in Ohio. And a big one is glacial till, which is this relatively soft mixture of sands and clay and boulders, and anything that the glaciers picked up while it was moving across Ohio. And there's also a little notebook for scale for the relative size of that big boulder. And just as all this is named glacial till, that's where these till plains in this simplified map, that's where their name comes from on the left. So all these plains are areas where they have similar age deposits from the Ice Age. And because these glaciers picked up all this rock and soil and wildlife, and sometimes even older rocks and fossils that were already formed in the bedrock that the ice picked up and was found in many of these tills, we can kind of think of today as more of a till talk instead of a rock talk. And if we're going to think about these major glaciations, the first major glaciation is in the Pre-Illinoian. And that's all the way down here in southwestern Ohio, where we have a small piece of it exposed. So all the ice went all the way down south to that point and further. But it was so long ago, it was 300,000 or more years ago. So we don't have too much information about it. And then that brings us to the Illinoian, which is a little bit sooner. They came after the Pre-Illinoian. And the ice went to about this boundary in Ohio. And then after that, we had the most recent glaciation, which is the Wisconsin glaciation, which destroyed or overtopped all these older glacial deposits. And these are about the age that you're more likely to find Ice Age fossils, this 24,000 to 14,000 year age, and then there's also ones sooner when the ice was no longer here. And one thing to know about the Wisconsin, it's kind of separated into two colors on this map, and that's just because there are two different textures. So one's a little bit clayier and one's a little bit siltier. But if you look on the map, there's also a little section known as the Lake Plains, which are it's an area where ancient Lake Erie was, and it kind of covered this whole area. And this big water body made the land very flat here, like the bottom of a lake. So if you've driven around here, you might have noticed how different this area is compared to other parts of the state. So I mentioned sometimes you find these Ice Age fossils stuck in till. Well, here's an example of a spruce tree stuck in till, some of the wildlife caught in the glacier's path. And Andy will talk a little bit more about spruce trees in a bit, but just know that these fossils can be found in till. But they're not always exposed and hidden or exposed at the surface. Sometimes they're hidden beneath layers in the subsurface. Here's an example of this till field in Ohio. It's relatively flat, kind of boring, but underneath it may be riddled with fossils if you're lucky and you happen to strike it and hit one of these fossil-rich little layers or pockets where an animal may have been died or been carried away by the ice. So sometimes you can find these Ice Age fossils or just pieces of old fossils from the bedrock that was left behind and the glaciers moved and deposited there. And sometimes you can even find stone tools from native people sitting atop these till plains. So when I say fossils, these Ice Age fossils are a little different than the fossils that we talked about in past webinars because they're not found in bedrock from older time periods like we talked about before. So what exactly is a fossil? So although these Ice Age fossils will still remain of an ancient organism, which is the simple definition of a fossil, these Ice Age fossils are younger and they're found embedded or fallen out of these glacial materials like till. So they haven't been through a lot of significant changes, like they haven't been turned into a rock or turned into a mineral. So even like this spruce tree that we're shown here isn't really dramatically different than modern trees that we see today. Or is it? Maybe there are some things that we can't see, and Andy will get into that. But this is a fuzzy line, so some people may not even consider these things fossils. But to establish some order, some people cut off the name fossil at about 10,000 years. But unfortunately, that's still kind of on the fence with some of the age of these remains. But either way, we can learn a lot by studying them. And we don't always find these Ice Age fossils just in till. We can find them in other things, like outwash, which are sands and gravels. They're very big, coarse stuff where these sands and gravels came out of the glacier and washed away as meltwater streams from the ice. And there pieces of the surface can be picked up and trapped in these sands and gravels and can be damaged and beaten around a little bit. But we also had other things like lake sediments where glacial lakes were made in front of the glaciers, and either chunks of ice were stuck in the ground and they melted, or there were just pools of meltwater left behind these silt and clay layers. And similarly, there were also peat bogs where we had a bunch of organics and mushy plants and stuff were found. And these animals and plants could have fallen into these lakes and stayed safely preserved. And these are locations where we have the most in-place fossils of this time. However, they can be plucked away from all these deposits in place and be found almost anywhere in glaciated and even unglaciated Ohio, especially in modern day streams. So this is a spot in Florida shown here, known as the Peace River. It's a famous hunting spot. There's a YouTube video of this diver here holding on to a mammal tooth that he found in that river, and that can have been found all the way upstream. So the rivers carry all these potential fossils upstream, and they could end up downstream somewhere. And there are examples every year of people finding Ice Age mammal teeth and other bones in Ohio, especially along modern streams, because these teeth are a little bit tougher and they're easily identified compared to the rocks and other things around it, because they're shaped so differently. But we also have caves and sinkholes where we find these fossils also. So animals can fall in these pits and get trapped and hidden from destructive forces, or they're hiding in them before they died. Here's an example of a Sheridan Cave pit in Wyandotte County, where these fossils were found along with Native American artifacts like the stone tools. So that leads us to believe that these ancient people likely used these animals as some sort of food or to make some type of equipment. But overall, the forms of life in Ohio were similar to what we see today. but some were a little bit more adapted to survive a cold landscape. So we had modern day species like the grizzly bear or snapping turtles or salamanders and turkeys. And some of these animals, such as insects and even other types of amphibians, reptiles, and birds, they're not as common in Ice Age finds and remains, or at least they're not as well preserved during this time. And this brings me to an opportunity to briefly talk about how these animals are actually preserved and how easily they are broken up after they die. Because these organisms have these soft pieces like skin that quickly decay away after the organism dies, they're almost never found as complete skeletons when we find them. You know, take a piece of fruit, for example, like if you're thinking of making a fossil peach and you just left it outside and you let it sit in hopes of it becoming a fossil someday. Just think of all the different things that could happen to it after you leave it outside without any protection. You know, animals can eat it, it can get rained on and washed away, baked in the sun, fall apart, stomped on. There's just so many things that can destroy it. And the same thing happens to a lot of these potential Ice Age fossils, unless they were protected quickly or carried away and quickly trapped. So we also have some mammals that are around today on Earth, but some of them weren't around Ohio, at least not anymore, during the Ice Age, like 10,000 years ago. Some of them are not found, like the muskox or the elk or bison or even some porcupines. But we also had other animals like horses and raccoons. And these Pleistocene aged bones are often confused with the modern day bones because these animals look so familiar and their bones are often found in fragments. However, there are some mammals that are extremely different in the past than they are today. And these are known as megafauna. So the Ohio is inhabited by these big, interesting beasts that weighed over 100 pounds or so. And these large animals are pretty much extinct now, or they moved elsewhere, migrated or evolved. So let's get more familiar with some of these big animals that once inhabited Ohio. So let's start out with my favorites that come to mind when I think of the Ice Age, the mammoths and the mastodons. So people often get these two confused since they both look like elephants. But mammoths are actually more evolutionarily closer to elephants, like the ones that you'd see in Africa or the Asian elephant pictured here. And they like to graze on grasses and grasslands, where mastodons were a little bit more distant evolutionarily. But both of these long-trunked animals, the mammoth and the mastodon, are herbivores, so they eat plants. And they likely traveled very far distances from Africa, Europe, Asia, and eventually across that Bering Strait that I mentioned, and then eventually made their way into Ohio after many generations. So what are some visual differences you can see between these two beasts? You can see that the mammoths perhaps are a little bit taller. They're about 13 feet tall, actually, and they're slimmer, had these humpbacks, which we think might be related to how they kept warm. And they like to live in these open grasslands where they could eat small grassy plants. And their lifestyle is indicated by their teeth size or in their shape. It's kind of flat and ribbed and similar to modern day elephants. Whereas mastodons were a little bit smaller, about 8 to 10 feet tall or so, but they were more muscular and they had these flatter heads and like to live in forested regions where woodier plants grew. And their teeth reflect that. They're a little bit more cusped and pointed and they're designed for breaking apart woodier branches and shrubs. So now hopefully if the screen sharing is switched, I'm going to show you some examples of some of these Ice Age bones. So can you see this here? This is a tooth, a big chomper from a mammoth. So this is actually a resin or a replica of the tooth, or specifically a molar. And this spiky part you might think might be a tooth, you can see here, but this is actually the root. This would go down into the jaw of the mammoth. So you can imagine, just comparing it to the size of my head, these things were huge. So imagine all these big teeth in your mouth. And because they were so big and mammoth's teeth their mouths had to accommodate their trunk, they only had about 2 of these on both sides or so on each side. But you can see by the flat ribbing here that it was flatter compared to like maybe the like the mastodon tooth I'm going to show you in a moment. So it's easy to grind within these ribs, all these small grassy plants. So think about your own teeth. Your back teeth are meant for more grinding, so a little bit smoother and flatter, and your front teeth are sharper, so they're meant for more ripping and tearing. So I also have a replica of this mastodon tooth. Again, this crazy sharp piece here is actually the piece that would go into the root, so it's not actually the tooth itself. This is the tooth itself, where the animal would eat and grind woodier plants and things. So you can compare these different types of teeth, to your own, compare them to your cat and dog, and it kind of helps you understand that these different animals ate different types of food, or at least they preferred to. And then also for comparison, I have these models from Mark Peter of the mammoth and the mastodon for comparison. So hopefully you guys can see that. So we can see that these are to scale, so these are about the same size they could scale down a little smaller compared to what they would be in life. So you can see that the mammoth is a little bit taller, and its tusks are actually a little bit, they're curved and they're shaped a little different compared to the mastodon, who actually had more horizontally shaped tusks. And these guys would be a little bit lower down to the ground. They could walk around in the forests and things and not be as encumbered and find all these woody plants to eat. You can also see by this mastodon, or the mammoth here, that little humpback that I was showing you before, which may be related to warmth. So another thing that's kind of interesting between these two is that the mastodon's legs were about the same size and length, but the mammoths had a little bit longer front legs, so it was able to walk a little bit differently and stood upright a little more so than its mastodon cousin. So I have a little bit more to show you here about the mammoths and mastodons. And that is that you can find your own mastodon complete, more or less, at museums around Ohio. And here's one on display, in Columbus, the Conway mastodon, which was found in an old glacial swamp in northwestern Ohio. This is from the Ohio History Connection Museum. You can also see other ones if you're visiting or live near Cleveland at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History Museum. And that one is named as the Johnstown mastodon, which I showed you a picture of before of its remains, and I'll show you again towards the end of the presentation. But you can also see by this map from the late 80s or 90s, this is actually from our Fossils of Ohio book, or Bulletin 70. Oh.
Hey, Tyler, I don't see it.
Okay. Share. Oh, do you see it now?
Yep.
Oh, sorry about that.
In a second.
Okay, so there is the Conway mastodon I mentioned before, the Ohio History Connection Museum. And here's the map of the different fossil finds of these animals that you might find in Ohio. And you can see that the mastodon, these circles, appear throughout the counties. And then you also have the triangles, which represent the mammoths. And you also see these indeterminate little squares. And often the remains of these bones left behind do not have these teeth, which are so easily identifiable from one another. So they're otherwise kind of too similar for anyone that's not an expert to identify. But we know about for every one mammoth we find about 3 mastodons. So we think that mastodons are more common in Ohio when they were alive, which you can further interpret this as perhaps Ohio is more of a forested landscape because we find more mastodons and more of their habitat, as opposed to a lot more open grasslands where the mammoths like to live. But that, maybe we'd need more evidence than just the occurrence of these mammoths and mastodons. And Andy can get into that a little bit. But you can do your own investigating to see if there's a mammoth or a mastodon or any other Ice Age finds in your county throughout Ohio since then. So not every megafauna survived on plants for food, though. Here's this example of the short-faced bear, which is around during this time, thought to be a meat eater or a carnivore. But either way, this guy was likely one of Ohio's biggest predators amongst the megafauna. You can kind of judge as a size comparison on the right. There's a larger versions than some of the bears that we see today. Its snout was a little bit shorter compared to modern bears, which is where the name comes from, which is somewhat misleading because, perhaps this snout might not have been in the same position in the skull, or not if all of it was preserved. So actually maybe the snout stuck out a little further too. So it's worth mentioning that a lot of these recreations that we see of these extinct animals are pretty much our scientists' best guess on what they look like, because we don't have any pictures around or really detailed drawings of when they were alive today. So we use fossils and combine with some of their modern day ancestors to get an idea of what they look like. And they likely denned, or they sheltered themselves in caves. And we know that they probably denned or ate a lot because then they might need to hibernate. And they weighed almost a ton, actually, and they're about 10 feet tall standing up. So one thing you may have noticed compared to the short-faced bear is that they have a little bit longer legs. So judging by these, their legs and their stature, they could probably run 30 to 40 miles per hour, we think. So that's way faster than most people, even if you're on a pedal bike. So just trying to imagine outrunning this thing in the forest. So that brings us to something that might be a little bit slower, if you think that's too fast, which is the ground sloth. And these are some of the examples of the most extreme cases of how familiar animals that we think of today were radically different than in the past. So these are large and tough-built mammals with this massive skull, and they weighed over 2 tons. They could reach 10 to 15 feet tall, which is likely good for grabbing onto high-reaching, vegetation and branches. They could likely stay on their hind legs, kind of like how this skeleton is shown from the Orton Museum at OSU, but they probably were a little bit off balance. So they actually used their tail, we think, as like a little tripod or kickstand to help keep them from falling over when they stood up. So they were able to reach up to these high-reaching branches. And so although they're kind of named after these cute animals like the 2- and the 3-toed sloth, there's pretty big differences in just size and shape alone. But we think that these sloths kind of had a similar ancestor somewhere, but they're not very close evolutionarily. One thing you'll notice is that if you look at the ground sloth's hands, they had these gigantic claws. So now I'm going to try another attempt at sharing my screen. I'm getting away from that and showing you an example of what their claws were like. So this is how big they were, size of my head for comparison. These things were huge, and this is just one of their claws they had attached to their big paws, their big hands. So as you might expect, this thing might be sharp, even though this is a replica. But they didn't actually use these claws for defense, for attacking and hunting wild animals. They did use them for defense, and they mostly used them for foraging through plants and going and reaching and scraping plants down from the high-reaching branches and digging through the ground. But they could defend themselves with this. And then also I have a little example of what the full life, the ground sloth might look like scaled down. You can see this model here has him with a little tail that helps him balance, so he can stand upright on his hind legs. But you can see how kind of warm and fuzzy he was, so I bet he'd kind of give some nice hugs if you're around during that time and the Ice Age being so cold. But there's one more thing I want to share with you about the ground sloth, and that is his name, how he got his name. So I think we're good. Sharing my screen again. So that is its name, Megalonyx jeffersonii, and this is named after a famous person, an author that you may have heard about in history class, and he was also interested in fossils, this Thomas Jefferson, and he collected caves in West Virginia, or collected fossils from caves in West Virginia, sorry, and this animal actually means, the Megalonyx jeffersonii means giant claw Jefferson, because he had a huge claw and is named after Thomas Jefferson. So let me draw your attention to another animal that's named after something interesting or important. That is the great state of Ohio, Castoroides ohioensis, and this is the giant beaver. And this is the largest rodent, and this large rodent was common in Ohio and was likely the size of a modern black bear, so they were quite big. But these ancient beavers likely did not behave like modern beavers that we think of today. So we don't think that they built dams or they gnawed on trees often, but they were still aquatic animals and liked wetlands. Interestingly, these giant beavers coexisted with some of their smaller beaver cousins. So these niches or these little jobs in the ecosystem, like building dams and things and rivers, was kind of already taken care of more efficiently by these smaller beavers. So these bigger giant beavers probably spent their time doing something else. So I have an example of these two beaver skulls to show you a comparison of what they look like. So this here is a modern beaver skull, so it's not a replica, it's the real thing. And then we also have the replica of a giant beaver skull. So you can see how different they are in just their size. Barely fit on the screen. So you actually see that their skull shapes are relatively the same, other than it being, much bigger. They had similar teeth, even though just a little bit bigger. But one of the things you might notice the difference between these two animals is their incisor teeth. These are the front incisors right here. Get that off in the distance here. So these giant beavers actually had these large, rough, and kind of clunky front teeth. So they probably were not as effective for tree gnawing. We think they probably used their front incisors for digging around and ripping up aquatic vegetation to eat, rather than, chewing on these woodier trees and plants. But as you can see by the modern beaver skull and his incisors, they're a little bit smaller and they're like chisel-like. So they're a little bit easier for gnawing on trees and a little bit more effective. And one thing you may notice about these modern beaver teeth is that their teeth, these incisors, are orange. So why do you think that might be? Well, it's not because they didn't brush their teeth, even though that might be part of it. The main reason why their incisors are like this is because it's actually coated in iron. So their enamel has an iron coating. That's what makes it kind of orange and rusty. So this iron coating makes their teeth very strong and durable. So they're able to nibble through bark very easily. So let's bring your attention to another mammal that we had around during this time. And that is the elk-moose or the stag-moose. And they were around during these similar habitats like the wetlands and the lakes. And they had similar qualities as deer species today. So these moose-like animals are built slim, and they had these elaborate antlers that we don't see too often today. And it's believed that they ate plants around glacial lakes, and they like to live by these mixed woodlands and pastures. And some of these environments were really kind of like a delicate ecosystem during deglaciation times when the landscape was rapidly changing. But if you're around during this time, this would have been a prime animal to hunt. So if you and your families are into hunting, just imagine finding a big beast like this and provide food for months. I'm kind of curious about what it would taste like. It might be a little gamey, but I think it would be an interesting comparison to deer meat or venison today. So speaking of hunting, we know that some animals are fierce predators. And some of these animals that we have, or that we don't have actually, are the saber-toothed cat and the dire wolf. We don't have any evidence of them existing in Ohio. So these fierce animals likely lived in Ohio, but we don't have any fossils or bones or anything that I know of, at least as far as this recording, or maybe they're not properly identified. But nearby states do have evidence of them, so we think that's likely why they might have been around here. It also might have been that they lived in a different habitat. So maybe they like the more mountainous regions to the southeast, and this would also fall into the unglaciated portion of Ohio, where they have more hiding places and could hunt around a little easier. But the glaciers didn't advance much into these mountainous territories, so perhaps they were preserved in glacial deposits like in other parts of Ohio from other animals. So I recommend that you keep your eyes open when you're exploring Ohio, because you can be the first one to find one of these predators. And if you do you find anything that's an Ice Age fossil, make sure to let a museum or university or even the Geological Survey know. Maybe you can help identify it, and you can help contribute to science. So where did all these megafauna go? So as I mentioned at the beginning, these glaciers advanced and retreated and changed the landscape. So the organisms had to change or adapt too, or move away or face extinction. And some of these large organisms were the first to be affected by these significant changes. And also, mostly because some of them lived in delicate habitats like wetlands, and along with some of their food that like to live in these habitats as well. So it might made it, kind of difficult to survive once these habitats went away. And many of these organisms are gone by about 10,000 years ago. That depends on the animal. And we know this because we radiocarbon dated their bones or the materials that they were found in. And Andy will talk a little bit more about that. But this megafauna extinction likely happened because of this climate change and habitat destruction. But there's also may have been a contribution with the arrival of humans. So I'll show you an example of this. This is it's a little stone tool that might have, contributed to the death of one of these Ice Age animals. So humans are another animal that made their way into Ohio during the Ice Age, and they crafted these stone tools to survive. We often find leftovers of them today. I actually found this one doing field work in Ohio a couple months ago, just found in the middle of a plowed field, recently tilled. And I think it's a form of a spear point, but I'm not an archaeologist. I don't study ancient people and civilizations, so I couldn't tell you for sure. But I do know that it's very sharp at its tip, at its point, which could easily cause damage to bone. So some people think humans actually overhunted these large animals, which further pushed them to extinction. And this is kind of indicated by these damage marks that we find on Ice Age bones in Ohio occasionally, and then through other parts of the earth. So just like the ancient people, I too am looking for my first Ice Age animal, these megafauna, but they would be, as bones or as a fossil. So as I mentioned before, we had these big animals, but we also had some smaller animals that could be found in these peat bogs and streams and sinkholes. And these are exciting to geologists because it helps us indicate the environment that they were living in during that time. And gets us an idea what the glaciers did to Ohio. So although I kind of touched briefly about what the Ice Age was like in Ohio, I have a couple other publications from the OhioDNR and the Geological Survey that might teach you a little bit more about this, such as the Ice Age in Ohio leaflet, number 7 by Michael C. Hansen. You might be able to find it online, part of our publications. And it talks more about what the Ice Age and its importance in Ohio. And then more recently, we have a geofact series, and it talks about little assets and facets about geology in Ohio. We have one, number 33, the Ice Age in Ohio, Evidence Beneath Our Feet, which talked more about how the ice moved in Ohio and some of the till landforms it left behind. So now we might be able to answer some questions, and I'll pass it off to Andy so we can talk a little bit more about how he applies fossils to research and mapping.
Yeah, Tyler, we have quite a few questions. So,
oh boy.
Am I echo? Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you okay.
Okay. So I don't know if Tyler and Andy, if both of you want to answer, that's fine. I'll switch the screen back and forth. But so you talked about if you find a fossil, are you supposed to let an expert know? You kind of touched on that, but somebody had also asked, can you keep it? So we'll go into more detail next week about finding fossils, but do you have a piece of advice for viewers today?
Well, some people, it depends on the rarity of the find. Like if it's a saber-toothed cat fossil or something, then you should give it to somebody that's a scientist so they can verify it. Because even if you find it yourself, it doesn't really mean as much because you don't know exactly what it is, and you're just kind of hiding it away from other people. So I think it's always best to give it to somebody to identify, but in most cases, they either give it back to you or they give you a replica like the ones I showed you before. So you can have the same thing that's a little bit more durable and can last a much longer period of time than you have the real thing that can exist in a museum that everybody can see.
Okay. Okay, so we had Fossil Fan out there, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Rentaro, both asked, are there any animals that are related to the Ice Age animals that you talked about? So it sounded like maybe there's a relative of the common bear. Anything else that you wanted to add?
Yeah, basically all the Ice Age, these big ones I talked about, have some type of modern relative, but I'm not really a biologist. I don't really know the intricacies of how they're all connected, but I do know that they're very close relatives. So they have, like I told you about the elephant. Like the elephant's closely related to the mammoth that are around today, just not in Ohio. So, and the giant beaver in the modern day, like the North American beaver, they're very close relatives. So we do have examples of them around in Ohio, just not the big versions of them that were around during the Ice Age.
Cool. And Rose has been with us for the past 3, I think, Ohio Rock Talks. She was wondering if anyone's found a mammoth footprint.
Ooh. I don't know for sure. That's a good question, because stuff like footprints would be known as a trace fossil, and they're generally kind of preserved and held together after they become a rock. So, like last week we were talking about the tetrapod footprints found in sand and mud and things, and they're encased, and then you can see kind of what they look like, the actual imprint. But because a lot of the things that are found today from the Ice Age are soft, there's a little bit more, it's more likely that they would be washed away and those footprints would get washed away with the surface, with it raining and things like that. But that's a good question. I bet there are some that people have found in other parts of the earth. I'm just not so sure about Ohio.
Okay, so Lynn wrote in and said, I've heard that the reason that honey locust trees have thorns was to protect it from the giant ground sloth. Is there evidence for that? Do you know?
Another good question. I don't know that answer off the top of my head either, but that's a reasonable assumption. When plants have those spiky pieces of branches and things, that generally means that they don't want other animals to touch them. So there's a way of protecting, for the plants to protect themselves against people like the ground sloth or animals like the ground sloth. So
we might have to check with our foresters and see if they know and get an answer for next week.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah. Have people found evidence of structures that beavers and sloths made? Recently, there was a find in Brazil of a giant sloth tunnel. So I'm guessing they're asking if there's any evidence in Ohio of those structures that beavers and sloths made.
Not exactly the giant beavers, because we don't, especially in Ohio, but yeah, they did do some digging. I can't think of any finds in Ohio that relate directly to that are tied directly to a ground sloth or a beaver though, or a giant beaver, for example. But
okay. And Cindy asked, did mastodons eat a more chewy diet?
A chewy diet. So I guess if the plants were chewy, they could chew it up more like bubble gum, I would say. So I guess that's a tough question. I think they kind of stuck more to the stuff they could kind of eat, like the plant branches and things like that. So not necessarily chewy like meat. So you might think of meat being chewy, so they didn't really eat chewy things like that. No.
Yeah, and okay, last one until we pass it over to Andy. Do you know why these animals were so much larger than their modern relatives? What is the thought to be the evolutionary benefit?
Right, so we see that in other periods of geologic time also. And a lot of researchers think that these because especially during the Ice Age, animals like to be bigger so they can kind of retain more heat. So they had all this fur and things to help them, but these large animals survived a little bit easier if they had a bigger body, so they could retain more food and things during times when maybe plants and animals and other food weren't around. So we think that maybe that's also linked to their size, and also that other animals that, some animals were, they adapted to stay a little smaller so they can maneuver a little bit easier. But that left these opportunities for other animals to evolve and get bigger, and they could occupy certain other facets of the ecosystem where they could take advantage of reaching the taller branches. Like you can think of a giraffe trying to get, reach up higher to get higher branches and things like that.
So actually kind of going off of that, I just see a new question had come in and asked, are these animals larger than their modern day counterparts because of the oxygen level?
That's a good one. Good tie-in, because last week we said that the oxygen levels were tied to how insects got bigger during like the Pennsylvanian period and such. So I don't think it's a direct tie to oxygen levels. I think it's a little different because the way that insects evolved, for example, they could take in the air through their exoskeleton, but these mammals are kind of similar to mammals today, and they breathe with their lungs and things. So I don't think it had to do exactly with, a lot of increased levels of oxygen. I don't know if Andy knows about the atmosphere changes. Yeah, so between now and back then.
Well,
it was probably relatively similar.
Yeah.
And then, sorry, I know I said that the last one was the last one, but but one more, Tyler, before we go to Andy. At the beginning of the talk, you mentioned 3 major tills on a map. What characteristics of these tills tell the geologists when they came from?
Oh, this would be a great segue into the next section of the talk, because each of those tills, if you remember the different ages, they were pretty big. There's a pretty big gap in time. So we can use different dating methods by taking organics within that till or some certain sediments to figure out how old they actually are. So sometimes we take samples of these different tills and we send them off to get them dated. We interpret that data, And sometimes we go by what they look like. So some of these Wisconsin tills are younger, so they're not as broken up or damaged or weathered. Whereas something as Illinoian or Pre-Illinoian would show signs of it being out in the open for a long time. So it'd be stained and a little bit broken up and not as well structured or preserved the same way that you might find a younger till. So that's one way that or two ways, I guess, where we kind of find the difference between those different ages of till.
Cool. Well, I guess we can pass it on to Andy. And a lot of people have been asking where you can find these and can you fossil hunt in Ohio. So I just want to remind everyone, next week we will be covering everything about fossil hunting in the state of Ohio. So if you're ready, Andy, I'll send you live. Thanks, Tyler.
All right, thanks.
All right. Hi, everybody. Like Alyssa said, I'm Andy Nash. I'm a geologist here at OhioDNR. And I'll actually just switch around a little bit and just address that last question, since that does make a pretty good transition. Tyler had a great answer, but I just want to add that a lot of times you'll actually see a soil that's buried between these different tills. And so you'll see an Illinoian till, an Illinoian age till that might be 150, 160,000 years old. And on that surface, there's a soil that developed the same way that we have a soil developing today. And then it gets reburied by the later ice age, 20,000 years ago or so, and then buries that soil, and it's fully encapsulated. So we can tell there's a major difference or gap in time there. So with that being said, obviously my special is glacial geology. I study these tills in depth, make maps about what kind of deposits there are and where they are and how thick they are, all different kinds of maps. And when I'm making those maps, I really have two main questions that kind of guide my thinking. And they really are, how old are these deposits, or when were they deposited? And what was the environment like when these glaciers were depositing all these sediments? And so we can really answer those two questions by studying the fossils that are deposited within those glacial sediments. And so when I think about kind of those two or those fossils, I break it down into kind of two really basic categories. You have plants and you have animals. And so first we'll kind of talk about the plants and the different plant fossils. And I want to just briefly say that, you know, I've got a piece here because we were kind of talking about it of some of the glacial till. So you can see this is kind of a softer sediment. You can kind of break it off apart. And you can see some of the different clasts. But when we go out in the field, we might see something like this. It just kind of looks like dirt or sediment. You might not necessarily see fossils really readily or apparently, and you have to do a little bit of work first to find them. But other times you can see really easily some fossils. And so I've got a couple behind me that I can show you for some of the plant fossils. And no, this isn't a dinosaur bone or anything like that. It's actually an ancient piece of wood. And so this was buried by the glaciers in the glacial till. And you can see it's kind of got this dark black color to it on the outside. It's kind of like a patina where it looks darker and old. And some of the parts where it's flaked off, it looks more like regular wood. But one characteristic that you might not be able to see through this webinar is that it's actually really light. So if this was a piece of wood broken off a tree today, it would have much more water and kind of cellulose and a lot of those cell materials that make it a little bit heavier, like you're picking up a 2x4 at Home Depot. But this is really light. You can throw it around really easily. It's one way that we know, hey, this is a really old piece of wood. And then I've got back here another really cool piece of wood that I'll show you now. So this is kind of a cross section of a piece of wood that was recovered from a sand and gravel pit near the Cincinnati area. And you can see this is a really nice preserved piece of wood because it even has some bark still attached to it. But obviously this has been sanded nice and pretty. So you can kind of see all the tree rings that are in there. You can see those, each representing kind of different years of the tree's growth. And so we can use these to kind of understand what the environments were like, and we can identify that wood and figure out what kind of trees were growing and what kind of forests there were when the glaciers were coming across Ohio. But they might not be the best way because they're just harder to find. You know, Tyler had that picture of the spruce that was embedded in the till, And that's actually a pretty rare occurrence. You're not going to find those all over Ohio. But what you might find are actually smaller pieces of that tree. So things like leaves and needles and seeds, and even little pieces of pollen too that we'll talk about. And so to find those pieces, that's where you actually have to go into the sediment and look at kind of the microscopic level. And so what we do is we grab a bunch of sediment from the field and we take it to a different lab and we sieve it. And once we do that sieving, we get rid of all the silt and clay. And what you're left with is just the plant materials and some sand. And so what we can do now is start to go underneath the microscope and look at some of these things. And so just so you can see right next to me, I've got my microscope right here. And I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. So you should be able to see that. So you should be seeing a live picture underneath the microscope. Pretty cool, right? So
1 second there. I'm transferring it. And it's going live. Sorry, that was my fault.
Perfect. So you can all see that now, hopefully. So this is just kind of a big mess of plant material that was collected actually in Clinton County. And one of the tools that we use, you can see kind of in the smaller screen, is a paintbrush. And then also we can use these little forceps too to kind of grab things and manipulate things. So what the geologist does after they do that sieving is they have to go through here and figure out what is good and what do I actually want to keep. And so kind of like a cooking show, you know, when they put a cake in the oven and they pull it away, I'm going to do the same thing here because I've already looked through a lot of that stuff. And we can just look at kind of the best of the best here and look at some of these micro plant fossils. You know, if Tyler was kind of talking about the megafauna before, you can think about this stuff as kind of the mini fauna. So this is the really small plants that tell us a lot about the environment. So I'll just point out a couple things here. So this is called a picking tray, what I just put on the microscope. And you can see these little boxes that are kind of these gold plated right here. Each one of those is 1 centimeter, so you can get an idea for scale. And these are kind of the best bits here. And you can kind of see there's a really good example right here of a little needle that would have come off a spruce tree. And then there's a little stem, so we can zoom in on this a little bit more. And you can see that part right there is where that needle actually would have connected to the stem of the tree and eventually into like the branch. You know, these needles are connected right off the branch. They don't grow kind of like a deciduous tree where you've got leaves kind of branching off of a bunch of different stems, but they come off of one single branch. And so you can kind of see shift through the focus. So you can kind of see the needle back there too. You can see that structure where you've kind of got that ridge that goes right down the middle, and you can see my paintbrush there pushing stuff around. So you can kind of see that ridge right there. So one of the ways that we know that these spruce needles are spruce needles is we can compare them to their modern equivalents. And so I've got a couple that I picked off the spruce tree. Actually, this one I picked off a couple weeks ago, and this one I picked off this morning, just to kind of show you that as these things die and start to decompose, they do change a little bit. And so you can look at the one that I just picked off this morning. It looks really nice and plump and green. You can't really see that ridge that goes through the middle because it's filled with water and all kinds of different cells that make it a little bit more rounded. But as you start to decay, you see this one right here next to it. It's got that little bit of a ridge, especially right there where it would connect to the branch. And so I wanted to go back just real quick to look at some of these fossilized parts again, because there are some kind of interesting pieces that I picked out. And you can see this really shimmery, shiny piece right here that I'm pointing at. So that is a piece of charcoal. And so you might think that during the Ice Age, it's really cold and a harsh environment, but there were still fires during that time and wildfires. When lightning would strike some of these forests, they would still burn and have natural fires the same way that we have some natural fires today. And just as a one little look again, here's just a modern next to a fossil, just to get an idea of the way that you can look at two things underneath the microscope and compare and contrast. Say, hey, here's a couple needles the difference in these is 20,000 years, which is kind of cool. And so these needles are great for a couple of different reasons, as I alluded to earlier. They answer both my questions that I ask when I make maps of what was the environment like. So we know that if we've got spruce needles and we don't have oak leaves and things like that in the environment, then it must have been really cold, because spruce trees, they're growing now in modern environments in Canada and Alaska. And then the second question they answer is, well, how old are these sediments? And the reason they answer that question is because of radiocarbon dating. So now I'm going to drag this over to the screen. And I'm just going to do a really brief primer on radiocarbon dating, because I know that probably most people in this webinar aren't too familiar with it. And so let's actually just start in the bottom with this kind of schematic that I drew up. And so you can see here that the sun is kind of the great energy source here. And in our atmosphere, we have all this carbon floating around in the atmosphere. And normally 98.9% of all the carbon in the world has 12 protons and 12 neutrons. So it's we call it carbon 12, and that's the stable form that you might have learned about in chemistry class. And but the sun sometimes can create this reaction where carbons start to capture more neutrons. And in that case, if you capture 2 more neutrons, you create this isotope called carbon-14. And carbon-14, if it gets incorporated into the plants, which there's, maybe 0.1% of all the carbon or less is carbon-14, it gets incorporated in these plants, and then it dies and gets buried. And the reason why carbon-14 is so important is because we know that it's unstable and it decays at a really constant rate of about 5,730 years. And so what that means is that if you start off and you have this 100% of all your carbon-14 that's in your needle or your piece of wood or something like that, after 5,730 years, that 100% will drop to 50%. And then you can take another step, another 5,730 years, and that 50% will go to 25%. And so you can keep going down this decay curve, decreasing by half at every step for 5,730 years. And eventually you get to a point where you're out of carbon-14 and there's no more left in the system. And so you kind of reach a dead end. And so this happens at about 60,000 years. But since this is so predictable, we can pick up any piece of plant that was breathing in the carbon from the atmosphere and figure out how old it was by figuring out where you are on this decay curve. And so this is some real life data. These are some needles that came from the same exact site in Clinton County. And I sent them off, like Tyler mentioned, as we normally do, and got them radiocarbon dated. And you can see that this age of about 25,500 years ago is when these needles were alive and then buried by the Ice Age sediments. Now, that's not exactly the same as the calendar age, and there's different reasons for that get really complicated. But essentially, the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere changes over time. So we have to make a little correction. And we know that the actual calendar age is something more like 27.7 on average, 1,000 years ago. So these trees were alive 27.7 thousand years ago, and then the ice advanced over them and buried them.
Hey, Andy.
Yeah.
Somebody asked, is it because of the continental drift?
No, this is separate from continental drift. That's a different process with plate tectonics. So this is happening kind of in the atmosphere, whereas that plate tectonics is happening in the crust and below the crust. But one of the other fossils that I mentioned was the pollen. And if you were here last week, you saw Chris Wright talk about some of the pollen that's preserved in the coal, but we also have pollen preserved in our Ice Age sediments. And normally these are preserved in lake sediments. And so if you have a modern lake that formed right after the ice left, it's been recording history as it deposits lake sediments. And during that whole time, the pollen has been blowing in from the wind and landing in the lake and settling at the bottom of the lake and keep getting buried in these layers. And so as geologists, we can go and sink a pipe basically down into the middle of the lake and collect all the sediment out. And then we can sample it at random, or not random, standard intervals and figure out exactly what kind of pollen were at each interval and how much of them there was. And so The reason I'm not showing any pollen under this microscope is because they're really small. You can see this scale. This means 10 micrometers. So that's even 1,000 less than a millimeter is a micrometer. So really, really small. You need a very high-powered microscope. And you can see these very distinct different shapes for oak and spruce and pine pollen. And so when we go and look at that lake, and this is an example of Silver Lake here, which is just west of Bellefontaine in Ohio, we've got this record, this great record that actually was collected back in 1966. And so they collected over 25 feet of lake sediment. And you can see from this graph here, I'll kind of explain all the parts in the graph you're seeing. So this is telling you the sediment type. So all of this represents lake sediment. And at the bottom, you've got the glacial till, which we talked about earlier. And that glacial till is really the last record of ice in the area. So ice left and then left this landscape where you could have a lake form. And so when the lake started depositing lake sediment, right after the ice left, we see that it was really dominated by spruce, which is the blue line, which is the genus Picea, is spruce. And then the red line represents Quercus or oak. And so you can see there's this big transition right here, which likely occurred right about 10,000 years ago, where Tyler mentioned those megafauna went extinct. And so there's this big change where you go from more of a deciduous spruce and pine forest, and then you shift to the more, coniferous, into the deciduous like oak forest right here. And so this red line represents that big change. And this is where we get to more of like what we think of as modern conditions. You know, we've got a lot of hardwood oaks and hickories and those little chestnuts. Those were the forests that were around once the ice had fully retreated back into Canada and we warmed up a little bit more. And so this is a really good example of how much information we can get from just looking at some different plant fossils. And so I'll take that over and we'll transition now to kind of talking about some more of the animal fossils. And so the animals I'm going to talk about today are land snails. So you should be seeing those now. Some different land snails, and I'm going to grab my paintbrush again and just kind of start to show you. This is just kind of a big mix or assemblage of the land snails that were collected, and this is just 4 different examples from near Oxford, Ohio. And so I'll start to kind of separate them by species because they got all mixed up when I moved the tray. And so you can see this is what a geologist would do. You know, when we collect these, they're in the sediment the same way that the plant fossils are. So we have to go through that same process of washing them out of the sediment and cleaning them up with a sieve. And then we bring them into the microscope lab to actually identify them. And so you can see we've got a couple of them now kind of mixed. But the reason why snails are so great and so important is because they have a lot of really critical data about where they like to live now. And so they live in very specific locations. And so this is just kind of an example of 2 range maps plotted against each other. So you can see the species A, it's not really important what species it is, with red dots, and species B with the blue dots. And so if you were just looking at a fossil site and you had species B, well, you wouldn't really be able to know exactly what the environment was like, because these things can live in northern Ontario all the way down to North Carolina. So it's hard to reconstruct what the environment is like just based on one snail. But when you start adding more snails that are found at that same site, you can see that overlap in those ranges. And so snail A and snail B can only live together in kind of northern Ontario. So you can imagine that the more snails you have, if you have sometimes 15 different species at one fossil site, this orange circle can get narrower and narrower, and you really narrow down exactly what kind of environment Ohio was like at that time. And the second thing that snails are really great at is you can actually radiocarbonate them as well, pretty reliably. So we have lots of things that we can date and also get what the environment was like out of. So,
hey, Andy.
Yeah.
Rose had asked, what if the piece of charcoal was from a Native American fire? How would you be able to tell if it was a wildfire or a Native American fire? Do you know?
That's a great question. Just based on the charcoal itself, you wouldn't be able to tell. You would have to use kind of the context of the other sediments around it. And we know that this particular piece, because we've dated the site before, it came back at 28,000 years ago. So as far as the archaeologists know, there weren't native people living in North America at that time. We don't have records of that. So that's why we can kind of assume that it would be a wildfire. If you're looking at charcoal from like 10,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago, then there is a chance that it could be from Native American activity. Yeah, that's a good question.
Thanks.
So I just wanted to briefly talk about, because I know we're running over time a little bit, just some of these species and show kind of what their modern counterparts look like. Because that's kind of fun, just to look at the fossil and also what their modern ones look like. And these ones, you know, kind of like the megafauna, some of these have gone extinct, but most of these snails are actually pretty resilient and are still alive today, although they have changed and evolved as well, which leads to more and different species. But this is just kind of to show you that this is a member of the vertigo genus. So that's one step up from species on the phylogenetic tree, but you've got hundreds to maybe even thousands of species of the vertigo genus. And so they can be difficult to identify, but they have slightly different features within this. This is the aperture. So this is where the snail would have actually been living, and you can see how it carried its shell on the picture on the right. And then we'll move to one of its kind of cousins. And this is actually a species that we can identify pretty easily in North America. And this is Columella alticola on the right, which is the North American variety. And then I've got a picture on the left of columella, which is the European kind of variety. And so we have kind of a subspecies here in North America. They've evolved a little bit differently, but they still look basically the same. And they're always kind of 2.5 millimeters tall, and they've got this really skinny shell relative for other snails that's pretty straight. And you can see, if you compare it to the bigger vertigo that I've got right here, you can see this vertigo kind of tapers towards the top, and this one's kind of straight and narrow, and obviously a little bit smaller. But this gives us really great information, because this one was actually species A that I was talking about on that map. So this is a really cold-loving snail, lives in kind of tundra grasslands today in northern Canada and Alaska. And then here, we've got a really common snail today you might recognize, and the whole family of these called Succiniidae. And they're known by their common name, the amber snail or amber forest snail. And they would sit kind of like this. And one thing that you might notice right away is that the modern snail has kind of a yellowish brown color to it, or amber, I guess, right? And that's kind of lost with the fossil. That's because that color comes from a mucus layer that's secreted on top of the shell called a periossicum. So that's gone now out of the fossil. We only are really left with the hard parts when we look at these snails. And then the last one I want to talk about is just this genus Valonia. And this Valonia, there's fewer species of the Valonia genus. They're pretty unique snails, and they're really distinctive shells. This might be what you think of when you think of a snail shell, right? This kind of, or at least a land snail shell, this kind of shape to it right here. And they're really distinctive because they have this little, in their little opening, it's a flared kind of aperture. It kind of looks like a trumpet or a tuba, you know, like a musical instrument, where it's flared out like that. And you can see how in the picture how they would carry their shell kind of on their back too. And then it's got some distinctive ribbing and things like that on the edge of the shell that help us narrow down exactly what species this one is. And so when we combine all of those things together, we can really start to understand what the environment was like and when things were being deposited. So that'll kind of wrap it up for me. I hope that I left time for questions. I know we've gone a little bit long today, but I'm sure there's a lot of questions because I had to rush through some things. So thank you.
No, you're fine, Andy. I asked some of the questions as they came in and answered, you know, some in the chat, but Fossil Fan did have one question that I wanted to still ask before we go, and this could be for you, Andy, or for Tyler. How come there are mammoths in Ohio, but their relatives are in Asia and Africa? Thought that was an interesting observation.
Can you repeat the first part? It broke up on me a little bit.
Oh, sorry. So I think we talked about, mammoths are distant relatives of the elephant, right? And so they asked how come there's mammoths in Ohio, but their relatives are in Asia and Africa.
Okay. Yeah, so I can pass it back to Tyler if he wants to.
Sure.
Okay.
To handle that.
All right, Ken. My mic on? You hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Well, that kind of relates to that Bering Strait land bridge that I talked about, because there's other, if you notice, there's other animals in other parts of the, different continents of the Earth that look similar, or they have similar, species or ancestors. So the reason why that, some mammoths, they kind of migrated towards these colder climates or certain habitats that they like to live in. And because they were able to cross these different continents and end up and go across the Bering Strait, that's how some of them ended up in North America. And some of them, stayed behind and occupied older habitats and landscapes that they were used to, essentially. I don't know if that helps or answers your question, but.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. So we're a little over time, so I'm going to wrap it up. Do you have anything that you wanted to add, Tyler, Andy, or Chuck, before we go? No? Okay. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. We'll see you next week. Once again, we had a lot of questions about where to find fossils in Ohio, what kinds of fossils you can find in Ohio. So I just want to remind everyone that next week we will have our paleontologist Mark Peter and geologist Brittany Perrick with us, and they're going to be talking all about what kind of fossils are in our state and where you can find them, if you can keep them, what permits you need to have. It's a great activity for families to get out and be active and have some fun, exercising your mind and your body. So we'll see you next week at 10. Thanks.